This evening I want to turn your attention back to Matthew chapter 5, and we want to focus on two more verses. We've looked at several of them already, and combined the first two actually, but then now I want to combine verses 7 and verse number 9. Matthew chapter 5, verses 7 and 9. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And then verse 9, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are the merciful, and blessed are the peacemakers. Tonight I'd like to speak to you about the subject of the mercy God blesses. We've looked at the humility, we've looked at the attitudes, we've looked at even this issue of the urgency in verse number 6, the urgency that God blesses, and now tonight the mercy God blesses. Among the Greenlanders, it was considered a sacred duty for a family member, maybe particularly a son, but the family member to avenge the murder of a father. And at 14 years old, a young man that we're going to call Hans, he was present when his father was killed. Hans grew to manhood, he got a job, he became a fisherman, an active fisherman. But during all this time, revenge is on his mind. That's what he's grown up knowing. That's what he was used to. And so he focused on, in his mind anyway, going back and making reparations for his father's murder. Eventually he did. He traveled back to the area at least where this his father's killer lived, in that general area at least. And in the process, before he was able to actually accomplish the deed, he was apparently somehow found or encountered some missionaries, and he began to hear what they were saying and listen to them, and the missionary told him about God's forgiveness and his need to show mercy and all those different things that were involved. But Hans grew angry. That's not the way they've known it. That's not what they've understood. He's come there particularly for the very purpose of killing his father's killer. And so he's not interested in that. He was angry. He went away, as I remember, and from time to time you could see him roaming up and down the beaches there in his new location, and he's trying to sort this out, and I'm not sure, but sometimes they maybe would see him gesturing even with the frustration of it all. An agony of mind. He returned to the missionary, and they talk about it some more, and finally it almost seemed, I think, that he was just, he wasn't going to be persuaded, he wouldn't be swayed from his purpose. But still, they probably had hopes at least that Hans would change his mind. At one point, anyway, when he came back, Hans explained that he had two minds. One said to kill, and the other said to show mercy. Well, Hans was gone for some time, and one day he came back. He showed up with a peaceful smile on his face. He said, "Now I am happy. I hate no more. I have forgiven." In the process of all of that, and of course there was more involved than just saying he forgave him, and so he sent a letter to his enemy, and he said, I've forgiven you. I'd like to invite you to come to my house, or and I think maybe they even returned that invitation as well. And so through the process of time, Hans actually went to his enemy's home and was spending some time with him. On his way back home, he realized that there had been a hole cut in the bottom of the boat that he was in. I think maybe a canoe or something. And he recognizes that the water's coming in and he needs to hurriedly get to shore. And I'm not sure what he even had to swim to actually get safely back to shore. He knew what had happened. He knew his enemy had done that. But he also recognized in that whole process of what he had done in seeking forgiveness and actually God putting forgiveness in his heart, he recognized actually his enemy has done this not out of particular animosity toward him, but because he's afraid of him. He was afraid he would still turn around and come back to bring revenge. And so he was trying to get rid of that danger. But Hans, I believe maybe told the missionary, he said, I will not harm him. I have forgiven him. Tonight our focus is often found lurking beneath the surface of what would seem like otherwise respectable people. People that ought to have things kind of, you feel like church people, they ought to have, you sort of buried the hatchet, as we might sometimes think. But occasionally, it'll emerge, and you'll see what's lurking below the surface. It'll remind us that it's there, though it may often go unnoticed. The bitter pill of unforgiveness. That issue in our lives that seems like we would like to have the victory over, but it seems like we're constantly dealing with this struggle. Particularly if there's something very major that has gone wrong in our lives, things that we've had to deal with that we don't like that. We feel hurt by it. We feel like there should be some penalty imposed for this. Like the portion of the Lord's Prayer in the next chapter, chapter 6 and verse 12 says, we must forgive in order to be forgiven. Let me read that to you quickly, though many of you would know it by heart. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Do we forgive as we want to be forgiven? Jesus said it here tonight in this passage. He says, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. It seems as though he's hinging that together. If we show mercy, we will be given mercy. And yet so often we want mercy, but we don't want to give it. We're a little bit hard on people from time to time. Philemon is a good lesson in this mercy, for he had the power to bring punishment. If you would turn over, it's a little bit hard to find. It's a real small book, but in the book of Philemon, right before Hebrews, that would help you a little bit maybe. Philemon, we could find some lessons on mercy because, forgiveness is a good thing, but if I don't have any power to do any differently, it seems sort of untested. We may not know for sure if we've really forgiven, and sometimes that can be a struggle. But Paul wrote to Philemon, pleading for mercy for Onesimus, who was a runaway slave. And of course, Onesimus had come apparently to Rome. He had come under Paul's teaching and had been saved. And so Paul now is sending back this runaway slave with a message, this letter that we find here in the book of Philemon. It's a letter asking for Philemon to forgive Onesimus. And so there are several characters here. Paul is serving as the peacemaker. Onesimus is the runaway slave. He's the one who's repenting. He's the offending party. And then you have Philemon, who is the offended party, the one who has to show mercy, the one that perhaps it might cost him something. And so we see all of those here. Let me just share a few lessons before we leave this book here this evening. Several places, several verses that sort of show us a little bit of what was going on in this particular case. Mercy depends on these things. First of all, verse number 9. Paul says, yet for love's sake, I rather beseech thee, being such an one as Paul the aged, and now also a prisoner of Jesus Christ. And so he's saying, you need a heart of love. If you really want to forgive, you need a heart of love. Then he goes down to verse 14, and he says, but without thy mind would I do nothing. He's saying, I would have liked to have even had Onesimus here to kind of take your place and fill a void for me and help me. But I didn't want to do that without your mind being in it. He says that thy benefit should not be as it were of necessity, but willingly. So we need a surrendered will. He said, I wanted you to be agreed with this. I wanted you to be a part of this. Verse number 19, he says a little further, we need to also recognize our own personal debt. I, Paul, have written it with mine own hand. I will repay it. Albeit I do not say to thee how thou owest unto me, even thine own self besides. So he's sort of humorous in a way, because Paul's saying, you really, you sort of owe me a debt already, and so maybe this will be a good way to repay it. Remember how much you've needed mercy, and I was able to share the gospel with you, perhaps, is what he's referring to. But he says, you need to have a recognition of personal debt. And then also in verse 21, he talks about a generous spirit. Having confidence in thy obedience, I wrote unto thee, knowing that thou wilt also do more than I say. And so he's saying, I know you'll be generous. I know you'll do even more than what I'm asking. And so those four things I'd like to just kind of just in passing, sort of leave with you, we need a heart of love, we need a surrendered will, we need a recognition of personal debt, and we need a generous spirit. But each of us is called, perhaps at various times in life, we may be called to any one of these things. The offended party, sometimes that may be us. Sometimes the offender may be who we are. And there may be other times where we are the peacemaker, the mediator, the one to try to help bring the offended ones together. In whatever case it may be, we need to show mercy. We need to be peacemakers. We need to be one who tries to bring healing. And so let's look at some of the ways we can overcome, or some of the issues involved in overcoming the temptations to withhold mercy. First one I want to notice with you tonight echoes, to some extent at least perhaps, Ephesians 4:32. Personally surrender your pain. Personally surrender your pain. Mercy and peacemaking can certainly be an outward display, but it needs to be rooted in the heart. And if we go over there to Ephesians 4, it's very common for us, and perhaps would just be important for us to take a quick reminder. But he says, "And be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you." And so we need to have this forgiveness rooted in a kindness, recognizing God's already forgiven me, and so I must forgive others. It needs to be rooted in the heart. You know, we can forgive a person when no one else knows how hurt we are. That might seem like a strange concept in this day. We'll probably talk about that in just a little bit. But we can forgive somebody even when it seems as though we'd like to maybe tell, we'd like to make this a public display, but we can forgive without making a big deal. And we also can forgive without somebody else even apologizing to us. Before we've even heard an apology uttered. And before it becomes a cancer in our mind, we can go ahead and forgive. Mercy must be chosen. Yes, it may take a mammoth act of the will, but we must purposely surrender our pain. Some years ago, I was pastoring in a particular area, and I had a neighbor that I was working with often, actually had her attend church a number of times, and was fairly faithful for a little while. But anyway, she had some issues in her life. She'd gone through some rough times. She was in just some difficult situations, and without getting into too much of that, she just had a hard time letting go. And as I would talk with her, I was able to share with her, and I believe God was helping her. But one particular time, it seemed as though God was helping me and prompted me sort of in an illustration of maybe how to help her and to sort of show her what this was like. And it came to my mind to maybe use the idea of a scar. You know, when we're hurt in some way, maybe we're cut or something has happened to us, and we have a bleeding. You know what happens before very long, at least if you're normal, if your blood works properly, then it will soon clot, it'll give a scab. And I suppose probably most of us have had trouble with that from time to time. I've got several scars on me, and probably a big part of the reason is because it's so easy to start picking at that. It itches, it hurts me, it bothers me, I just want to pick it and get it off of there. Well, you know, sometimes when we start picking at a scab, it starts bleeding again. It brings that wound to the surface again. Then we have to try to wipe it off and let it get another scab. And if we're not careful, pretty soon we start picking at the scab enough until it will leave a scar. Maybe it would have anyway, but it sometimes leaves an even worse scar because we wouldn't let it alone. And sometimes we do that very thing with the wounds that happen to our spirit. And sometimes we are bothered, we are really hurt, and it wounds us, and we feel bad, and we pick at it. We pick the scab. We want people to know how it hurts. We bring it up again and again. Maybe it's not even to anybody else, but just in our own minds. We pick the scab. And little by little, we're causing a scar in our life, and we're causing wounds, and we're causing bitterness. In this lady's case, I don't think she really even meant to, and I think she tried to correct it and tried to get some help, maybe even that illustration, maybe helping her to sort of surrender some of that to God. It was not an easy situation, maybe several things. But you and I need to do the very same thing. We need to stop picking the scab. It's not a question tonight of what's deserved. It's a matter of my own surrender of my rights. My own surrender of what I feel like is the just thing. The proper thing. They ought to be punished. They ought to have... Well, that's not what we're talking about. We're saying we surrender our will to God. I must choose to forgive no matter how unfair it may seem to be. Let's go back to the story of Joseph for a moment this evening. Genesis chapter 50. Genesis chapter 50. Verse number 19 is where we'll begin. You know the story of Joseph. Probably many of you do. He had already met his brothers. He had told them he was Joseph. And even at that time, he sort of urged them, don't you worry about this. God sent me before you. Don't worry about that. Now their father has died. Jacob is dead. And now they're afraid again. Now that Jacob's gone, Joseph's going to really get us now. But Joseph responded like this. He said, or it says here in verse 19, and Joseph said unto them, fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day, to save much people alive. Now therefore fear ye not, I will nourish you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spake kindly unto them. Maybe just stop for a quick moment there and just say, can you speak kindly to someone who's hurt you? It takes a mammoth act of the will, but we must purposely surrender our pain. The next one I want to notice with you is maybe a little bit more on the practical side. And it might not be very easy for us. But open the book of Proverbs, chapter 10. Let's go ahead and read that first of all, and then we can go ahead and I'll try to make the point that I want to make here. Proverbs chapter 10 and verses 11 and 12. The mouth of a righteous man is a well of life, but violence covereth the mouth of the wicked. Hatred stirreth up strifes, but love covereth all sins. So, second thing I want to notice with you tonight is that you need to properly silence your pity party. Now, that might seem a little strange, but it is important for us because we have a common inclination to talk about it. Maybe we've been hurt. Maybe we'd like to say, well, I've forgiven. But in reality, we want to keep bringing it up. We want people to think about it. We want people to know how hard this is for me and how much I've been mistreated. Mercy and peacemaking can be an outward display, but it really needs to be rooted in our hearts. And we really need to start letting it affect whether we talk about our issues, whether we have a pity party. May closely resemble this issue of surrendering our pain. But I want to just talk here a little bit about this issue of our speech. I think I mentioned it earlier, but I'll say it again. You can forgive even when nobody has even asked forgiveness. It's a matter of our heart. It's what we feel on the inside. It needs to apply to our speech. People sometimes can claim to have forgiven somebody, but then they like to share their concerns, Well, I just have a prayer concern. I just need to share this with you. You really need to be aware of what's going on. You really need to be aware of how, they've treated me in the past. Be very careful. It's all done as though this is some spiritual thing. But in reality, all it is this pity party. It's dredging things up again. It's causing people to question a little bit in somebody else's life. That's not pleasing to God. If we say we're showing mercy, but we keep dredging it up, what kind of mercy is that? Even the golden rule ought to apply here. Would I want other people telling everybody else about my problems? About my past failures? No. So I shouldn't do that to others who have perhaps offended me. Maybe another question is, how much would you like Jesus to do just what you do to others? How would you like for him to dredge up your past and say, now you better watch out for this guy. You better watch out. They might really do you wrong. They might really mess things up. I know what they've done. I'm sure Jesus is not pleased with our level of mercy when we go having a pity party and when we try to tell other people about how bad they've treated us or how somebody else has treated us. Properly silence your pity party. Keep your mouth shut. Tell your problems to God and let it go. The last thing I want to notice with you yet is that we also must purposely strive for peace. And we're bringing in a little bit more now, verse number 9. But I also want to take you a little further in this chapter to verse number 23. Matthew 5 and verse 23. Jesus is talking about those who will come. They're trying to come worship. They're maybe coming to church service, we might think. And he says, therefore, if thou bring thy gift to the altar, and there rememberest that thy brother hath aught against thee, leave there thy gift before the altar, and go thy way. First, be reconciled to thy brother, and then come and offer thy gift. This is a big deal. He didn't even say when you recognize you have something against someone else. He said when you know they have something against you. Maybe you feel like I'm not to blame. I was doing what was right. I feel like I'm in the right. He still says you need to go and be reconciled. Be a peacemaker in your own situation. You know, sometimes we can apologize even when we don't necessarily feel that we're wrong. Maybe just kind of prepare the way. Just say, I just want peace. Whatever there is, between us, whatever we're, been the struggle. It just seems like there's been a little bit of a division here. I just want it out of the way. I'm sorry for whatever has gone on that has caused this rift, and I just want to be at peace. We can be a peacemaker for ourselves. Part of that involves perhaps showing mercy, but it also is saying, I want to be reconciled. I want to purposely strive for peace. We're not only to endure the cruelty or the suffering, but we are also to try to be reconciled, to bring unity. I think it's Paul especially. It seems like he talks a lot about unity, endeavoring to bring unity in the bonds of peace and that kind of thing he's talking about. And Jesus specifically blessed the peacemakers right here in this sermon. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Can we even go so far as to say that the children of God will be peacemakers? We ought to be. Sometimes, when we're in the midst of a conflict, and that scarlet sort of seems to start rising up our neck, and we feel that urgency to respond, we feel that quivering in our stomach, we feel that pressure because we're in conflict, even then, we can strive for peace. Blessed are the peacemakers. Seems I've learned a little something through the years, at least I hope I have. Maybe I'll try to share it with you tonight. One key issue that we need to remember is that sometimes the conflict that you or I might prefer to say is carnality, is a spiritual problem. We'd like to say that they really have an issue. It might be nothing more than a personality difference. And because I'm strong-willed and because they're strong-willed, we butt heads. It doesn't have to mean that there's any sin involved. Sometimes it's personality. And we need to be careful that we're showing mercy enough to say, well, I'm not saying that they are wrong. I'm not saying that they're not going to heaven. I'm not saying they even have to apologize to me. I'm going to recognize that maybe we just have some differences. Our personalities clash a little bit. We need to be big enough sometimes to overlook people's faults or our personalities for the sake of peace and unity. This might be a novel idea, but we don't always have to pass judgment. But we can show mercy. We can say, it's all right. I'm going to let you in the Lord's hands. And I don't mean this I'm not talking about some sort of I'll just leave you in the Lord's hands. He'll take care of you. I don't mean that. I'm saying sometimes we just back off and say, Lord, help us to be at peace. Help us to be unified. Help us to be able to be be reconciled. Help there to be a unity among us and peace. Help me to show mercy. Well, in conclusion this evening, we all need mercy, don't we? Jesus said that we'll get it in similar measure as we give it. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Again, over in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Are we ready to say, Lord, I hope you'll forgive me just as much as I've forgiven somebody else? Where do you fit into this category? Have you been picking at the scab? Have you been dredging up the old hurts and wounds? Or have you been showing mercy? Every one of us faces hurts, and I'm not here to try to say it's no big deal. Every one of us has tough times. But God's blessing only comes to those who will surrender them to Him. And so tonight, are you ready to give up yours? Are you really ready to just say, I forgive? I want to show mercy. I want there to be peace. You can. You can right now. Let's each one bow our heads together.